Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so delighted to be here today with author Aimee Liu. Welcome.
Thank you, Erin. I'm very happy to be here.
It's truly my pleasure. A little bit about Aimee Liu. She is the best-selling author of Glorious Boy, which is the novel that we're going to talk about today. And you've got a copy right there. Oh, beautiful. So Glorious Boy. She is also the author of Flash House, Cloud Mountain, and Face. Her nonfiction books include Gaining, The Truth About Life After Eating Disorders, and Solitaire. Aimee's books have been translated into a dozen languages, and she also teaches fiction and nonfiction in Goddard College's low residency MFA program in creative writing in Port Townsend, Washington. So excited to talk today. Let's just start right there with Glorious Boy, that fantastic book. Please tell me about the book.
Well, it's a World War II family war story of loss and longing and the lengths that we will go for love. It is about the glorious boy of the title is a 4-year-old child who is mute, and he and the young girl who takes care of him hide during the evacuation of Port Blair, where they live, this colonial setting in the Andaman Islands. And the family has to go to great lengths to find out what has become of these children, where they've gone, and to try and rescue Ty especially. So a great deal happens in this book.
Yes, absolutely. It sounds like it. So the Andaman Islands, could you tell, for those of us who might not be familiar where that is, where are the Andaman Islands and how did they play out in World War II?
The Andaman Islands were a wild, primeval archipelago that's a couple of hundred miles off the coast of Burma in the Bay of Bengal. And they were the furthest west that the Japanese got during World War II. They arrived there in 1942 and they were there for the rest of the war. Before the Japanese arrived, one corner of these islands, this one colony of Port Blair, was settled by the British in the late 1800s. And they used it as a penal colony for Indian freedom fighters. So the Indians who were trying to gain their independence from the British Raj after several hundred years of colonialization in India, those who were arrested were sent to this middle of nowhere penal colony. And my characters arrived because the husband, Shep, is assigned to be a doctor in this colonial port. And it's calmed down quite a bit. It's less of a penal colony now and more of a typical British colony. But Shep's newly married after a very whirlwind sudden meeting with Claire in New York City. She's an aspiring anthropologist, and he sweeps her off her feet really with the promise that he's going to take her to this place where she can meet and work with tribes that go back 60,000 years in these wild rainforests, completely unsettled, uncivilized. The islands, other than Port Blair, are really primeval territory. And these tribes had lived there for 60,000 years. I mean, all of this is based on a historical fact. So she finds that irresistible because she wants to be the next Margaret Mead. She's enthralled by the story of Margaret Mead, as many of us were. And so off they go. And unfortunately, before they get there, well, unfortunately, she becomes pregnant. This is the late 1930s, and at 22, 23, she's got this newborn baby in the middle of nowhere, and she's trying to pursue her dream of working with these tribes and going off into the forest. And it's not easy, as you can imagine. And the only thing that makes it possible, really, for her to go off and do this work with the tribes is the fact that as her baby gets a little bit older, he bonds with the servant's daughter in the household. And she becomes, Nyla then becomes his primary caretaker. And these children, because Nyla's really, she's only 8 or 9 when Ty is born. So they're kind of growing up as brother and sister, and they develop this intuitive bond. And Ty has a very interesting condition, which is not an illness, but it is a developmental condition that makes him mute to everybody else. So he doesn't develop verbal language on time, but because he and Nyla have this unspoken relationship, they completely are in tune with each other. They're attuned to each other in the way that Claire, the mother, would very much love to be attuned with her child, but she's not. As you know, we like to think that all mothers are attuned to their babies, but sometimes it just doesn't work out quite right. And particularly if you've got a mother who's very young and not ready for motherhood and is preoccupied with other dreams and other passions and other ambitions, sometimes it doesn't work out quite right with the baby. And that's what happens here.
Fascinating, fascinating. And so you kind of went into some of the family story that is the story of this novel, and also some of the geopolitical stuff that's also happening at the time. So what drew you to this moment in history and this place in that moment in history?
This book has kind of a 3-part genesis. So part 1 was a completely random chance encounter with an anthropologist wife. And Clara is she's an anthropologist sort of in honor of this woman who introduced me to the Andaman Islands. So she came to a book reading for Cloud Mountain back in 1998. And I mentioned that I was interested in writing about India. And so she told me she was just back from this incredible place that had only just in 1998 just opened up to foreign visitors. So it had been closed off to Indians were allowed there, but no foreigners were allowed there. And partly that was because they were trying to protect these indigenous tribes from being exploited. So I found this story of the indigenous tribes and this wild place that nobody had ever visited. And, this strange bit of this history of it being a penal colony. I mean, this collision of cultures always fascinates me. I mean, it's what most of my books are about, partly because I'm a quarter Chinese. So I'm I feel like I'm at the crossroads of culture all the time anyway. And I also lived in India for a couple of years when I was little. So I have all of these things constantly sort of playing around in my head. So this got me going. But then I went off in other directions. So 5 years passed and I didn't really think about it. I wrote another book in the meantime. And so I was trying to figure out what my next novel was going to be. This is way back in 2003. And I had one of those dreams that wakes you up in the middle of the night. And the dream was the core pivotal event that starts the book off, which is there were two children hiding under a house in the middle of an evacuation of some kind. And the girl, the older of the 2 children, is hiding the little boy because she knows that his parents will not take her with them when they flee. And then they come out after a while of hiding, they come out and they discover that the entire town is deserted and there's smoke rising in the distance. And the girl has this thought of, what have I done? And that's when I woke up and got out of bed and wrote it down. And that was basically the beginning of the book. But at that point, even though in the back of my head I knew I wanted it to be in the Andaman Islands, this was 2003, and I hadn't been able to find a whole lot of information about Port Blair, the settlement, which is where it would have been. And so I tried for a while to make up a history. I tried to locate the story in 1980, in the 1980s. I was thinking about a lot of the evacuations and uprisings that were going on at the time in West Africa and sort of thinking of them as my models. There were stories in the news all the time about foreigners having to get out, suddenly from towns where they'd lived for 20 years and overnight it was exploding. So that's, I think, where the evacuation kind of thing came from. But it wasn't working because I couldn't figure out the history and I'd never been to the Andamans. And so it really didn't come together until 2010 when I was able to get to the Andaman Islands finally and smell it, taste it, feel it, you know, the humidity and the heat and this kind of languor in the air, and it's all incredible. And that presence of that intense forest, that intense rainforest just everywhere, was fabulous. But the main thing that happened was we went to this little island, Ross Island, which is where the colony was set. It was the cantonment of the British. It was where all the officers and administrators lived because it was away from shore. It was a little bit cooler. They could be isolated and protected. And it was like this little British colony with British, you know, Victorian architecture and all of this stuff. Well, it's ruins now, and it's fantastic in its own right as a thing because the trees and the roots have taken over all of the houses, what the skeletons of the houses and everything. Anyway, there's so much to say about that. But the main thing was that while I was there, my fabulous beloved, the guide who was showing us around, figured out what I was trying to do, and he got all of these materials, these books that were written by people who had grown up on Ross Island and grown up in Port Blair and had been there during the war and before the war and after the war. And they knew all, you know, they wrote about the local relations with the tribes. They wrote about the languages of the tribes. They wrote about, you know, all of the things that happened with the Japanese when they were there. And they wrote about the day of the evacuation of all of the foreigners in 1942, which was a very sudden, unexpected, overnight evacuation. And the first ship went out, and there was supposed to be another ship to come back for the 4 or 5 British administrators and the soldiers who had been left behind. And that second ship was torpedoed before it ever came back, and the Japanese occupied in the meantime. And then there's all kinds of stories of, you know, public executions by the Japanese, which I ended up using in the book, and espionage missions that were sent back to the islands to spy on the Japanese that honestly probably prevented the Japanese from overrunning India, because it had only been a matter of, you know, of days and weeks really since they had taken Singapore, they had taken Rangoon, they took the Andaman Islands, and they were poised to go to India next. And that was right about the time that America got into the war and they started to be arrested. But the intelligence that they got from the Andaman Islands, I think, was very, very, very important in keeping them, you know, contained.
Fascinating. And then to literally have your dream now located in like historical fact. I can just imagine the goosebumps you must have felt when you started to read some of those accounts.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I would say that the core family story is completely fictional. Claire and Shep and Ty and Nyla, they are completely fictional characters. But almost everything else that happens in the book is historically accurate and is based on true historical figures. So all the events, the executions, the espionage, the hospitals, the history before the Japanese of these fascinating, complex colonial characters who had gone out and done just unbelievable work on documenting the orchids and the medicinal orchids. Shep is he's enamored of the idea of finding the cure for everything in the forest. He believes in botanical medicine. And so that's his passion, while her passion is going into what she calls the time capsule of meeting these people and discovering the lives and all of that. And Yeah, for her, I mean, for both of them, the forest is magical and, unexplored and the opportunity of a lifetime. And, um, the war gets in the way, but also, unfortunately, their son gets in the way of those dreams too. And so that creates the core tension within the family. They love him, but and who of us don't, as parents, as working parents, we all know that feeling.
So, speaking of really interesting tensions that you played with in the novel, you mentioned that the son Tai is mute. And also, the indigenous tribe on the Andaman Islands, the Biya, also have this element of their language that is unspoken. And I found that to be a really fascinating parallel. And how can you speak a little bit more to how you played with unspoken language in a novel, which by its definition is a written language?
Well, the silent language came to me initially because of the 2004 tsunami that happened in the Bay of Bengal. And there was news reports that the only people who were unscathed by the tsunami were the indigenous tribes of the Andamans, who had read the silent language of nature, and they knew that tsunami was coming, and they all got to higher ground. And so they were the one group of people that were untouched by this natural catastrophe, and all of the civilized people who lived along the coastlines in Sri Lanka and the Andamans and Indonesia were decimated by this catastrophe. So that planted in my head this idea that there are people who communicate with nature, and they signal each other, and they don't rely on verbal communication. It was tricky to write that into the book, um, because, as you say, a book is a verbal language. So I had to just write around it and through the characters. And I did that in part by Claire studying the Biya and trying to wrap her head around their silent language. And that was sort of a source of interest and fascination for her, while at the same time she had this silent language going on at home. And it is the language of attunement. A lot of this book is about attunement. And so Claire has an attunement problem with her own son. They're not on the same wavelength. Nyla and Ty are on the same wavelength, and so they can communicate with each other without articulating their thoughts in words, because they can read each other's bodies, they read each other's eyes, they just get each other. And Claire is she's somebody who she takes a long time to sort of pick up these signals. She sees that other people are doing them, and it fascinates her with the Biya, and it hurts her with Ty and Nyla, because she sees that they have the ability to communicate with each other, and she can't break in. It doesn't include her. It's exclusive to them. And that's very painful and starts up this pattern of jealousy that resounds throughout the book and throughout the plot, and has really horrible, horrible, devastating consequences. But the more I researched this, there are a couple of people who have written books about silent language throughout the world, and different cultures are more attuned to speaking in silence or through silence than other cultures are. Our culture, Western culture, is highly, highly verbal. But there are a lot of other cultures around the world that are not, where there's other kinds of signaling that go on. And there's a lot of body language, there's a lot of eye language, and that's true in India and parts of India. And I tried to pull that in, all of it, in the book.
Oh, fascinating, fascinating. Well, thank you. Thank you for talking a little bit more about that. And speaking of books, as my last question, I'm super curious. We are a group of readers here at Must Read Fiction. So what books or what novels are giving you life right now?
Well, I am reading a couple of books by well-known people, and a couple of books and by less known. So I'm going to talk about two of which I have here in copies. One is Setting the Wire, a memoir of postpartum psychosis by Sarah C. Townsend. She's actually one of our star alumni at the Goddard writing program. And she's an extraordinarily beautiful writer. And this is a book about losing her mind after her baby was born. She also had very, very big problems with attunement. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons why it resonates with me. Different kind than Claire has, but for sure. And it's just so beautifully written. And I'm happy to say that her daughter is now a teenager and it's all long behind her. But she writes about this mental illness that's very few people talk about, but is really pretty common. And so that's important. I also just finished reading Sing to It by Aimee Hempel, which is an incredible collection of short, very unique. She's such a unique writer. She distills stories and characters down to this bare minimum where every single line has teeth, it just gets to you and under your skin. And she's a lot of the stories talk about her working with dogs in animal rescues, or the characters working with dogs and animal rescues. And it's just beautiful. I've never read anything like it. And the last book I'm listening to on audio tape, so I can't show you the cover, but it's called The Fisherman. And it's by Chigozie Obioma, who is a Nigerian writer. And I am just loving it. It is about three brothers, and myth and superstition is woven through their story and through their family, and the horrific event that is at the heart of this story. And I've never read anything quite like it, and I just am loving it. And it's all of these books are taking me away from the pandemic. They're taking me away from the coronavirus, and they're all reminders of all the important humanity that is out there and in us, regardless of whether we're outside or inside, or on this side of the world or on the other side of the world. So they bring us together in very different ways.
Yes, and that is absolutely what we need right now, is something to bring us together, even though we are separate, and things to take us away, right? To get us out of some of the uncertainty and some of the anxiety that's coming with this pandemic. And certainly, Glorious Boy, the wonderful book, Aimee Liu, thank you so very much for writing this book. Another book to add to your list, must readers, as a way to take you away. And Aimee, thank you so very much for writing that book and for taking the time to speak with me about it today. I'm so grateful.
Thanks, Erin. I'm grateful for you too. Thanks.